Thank you for tuning into this video about the budget process in the United States. Now, just as a reminder that these are considered notes, so hopefully you have your note packet available to jot down additional information. Also, feel free to stop the video at any moment if you need to rewind or just jot down a few additional facts. Now, before we get into the budget as far as processes, we need to go over some of the basics. And the basics of government when it comes to budgets, typically consist of a few terms for you. For example, a budget itself is, a policy document filled with taxes and expenditures. So it's filled with revenue, money coming in, and expenditures, money coming out. If we end up with more expenses, so more money going out than money coming in, that equals a deficit. So for example, this year, if the U.S. government, and I'll make up imaginary numbers here, if they were to spend $3.5 trillion, but only bring in $2.5 trillion, then they would have a deficit of $1 trillion. Now, we can't just have negative numbers at the end of our budget, because that wouldn't make any sense. We have to at least break even. What ends up happening is this adds into our national debt. Now, our national debt is essentially who we owe money to. It is a gigantic number of all the loans that we have out there, all the bonds that we have out there with other people and other countries. Now, just a little bit on other terms. Like, you may never have heard of expenditures before. Expenditures is a lengthier word that basically means the same as expenses, and this is what the government spends their money on. So later on we'll look at some graphics that show you what the government spends their money on. And revenues is the money coming in. So money coming from different sources. For example, it could be coming from taxes, it could be coming from different types of taxes, it could be coming from fines, because the government does certainly fine some people with some criminal activity. And whenever I refer to the national debt, of course, I'm talking about the total number of debt we have. The national debt is built out of those deficits. And we'll leave it there. Now, let's start with taxes. The first thing you really need to know is the 16th Amendment. Originally, the founders gave the federal government the ability to tax, but not via income taxes. So they could tax via, a sales tax or an excise tax, but the 16th Amendment allowed for the creation of an income tax. The federal government was not able to, be able to get enough money to be able to spend it on the things they wanted to spend it on, and this income tax is going to allow them to do so. Now, the income tax, of course, is where the federal government gets a lot of their money. It is administered by the IRS, so come, the spring, you'll hear about your family members potentially filling out their tax forms, filling out those taxes and sending them off to the IRS. What we have in the United States is what's often called a progressive tax. Now, if you can ask me to explain this on the board, I can certainly draw it up, but a progressive tax essentially means that the more money you make in a year, the higher your percentage tax is. So, for example, if you were in the top 1% richest people in the United States, you'd be paying roughly 39% in taxes. So 39% of your income would go towards taxes. Of course, unless you get some sort of deductions that might help you out. Now, in that same equation, if you were someone that was making, let's say, $5,000 a year, so one of the lowest income individuals in our United States, they would essentially be paying $0 in taxes. So it's a progressive tax that the more money you make in a year, the higher your tax percentage is, and the lower the money you make, the lower your tax percentage is. And it works out to roughly around 29% for the average person, around there. Now, this is different from what's called a flat tax. A flat tax would set a specific percentage, and everyone would get taxed that exact same percentage. So it is a little different from another potential system that has been proposed in the past. Now, in the United States, we have about 140 million different tax returns. So lots of tax returns coming in. And here's kind of the range of typical tax rates. A little bit more on taxes, who actually pays them. The bottom 42% essentially pay nothing after deductions, so they don't end up having to pay anything into taxes, whereas the top 1% ends up paying a good chunk of our tax revenue. Of course, some of the top 1% is making billions of dollars a year, which can certainly make an impact in the amount that we're receiving from them. Oh, and there are certainly some alternative ideas. I've already talked about the flat tax. What's the flat tax again, Mr. Glodowski? Don't mind if I answer that again for you. Essentially, it's a flat number that everyone would be taxed exactly the same. Some people would say, why do we have an income tax at all? Why not just get rid of it and create a sales tax? That way, when you purchase things, you are getting taxed by the federal government. So the wealthiest Americans would be, taxed more if they buy more things or they buy more expensive things. They would be facing that sales tax. Whereas the poorer individuals that may not be spending as much would also not be taxed as much. So it's another alternative idea that's been thrown around. You could essentially create that instead of the income tax. But, may not be as easy to figure out how much we're going to make with the national sales tax, as it depends on how much people are spending. Now, there is a special tax called the social insurance tax, which is essentially a payroll tax. So when someone is making income, like Mr. Glodowski, 6.2% of my income goes towards Social Security. And my employer actually matches that, and 6.2% goes to Social Security as well. Medicare is also another social insurance tax, essentially coming off your payroll. So Social Security is money for when you get older and maybe retire. Now, Social Security goes towards you eventually when you get older. And we're going to spend a lot more time talking about Social Security when we get to the public policy unit. But essentially, it is a way for older folks to retire and have some money given to them from the federal government. Of course, you are paying for Social Security by making income throughout your life. Medicare as well is a benefit for you when you get older. So it is essentially health care for when you are, at the right age, 65 years or older. And you pay throughout your lifetime 1.45% of your income towards that potential future health insurance. Now, both these are matched by your employer. That's certainly important. And that makes up a good chunk of our federal revenue, but is really set aside for those two programs. So Social Security and Medicare are pretty much funded by themselves. They're not funded by other taxes. Now, we talked about deficit earlier, which means that we are taking out debt. We can't borrowing. Essentially, whenever our tax revenue doesn't cover our expenditures, we're taking on debt. And the most common type of debt that we have in the United States are bonds. Now, these aren't just your typical, savings bonds that you might have been given as a child from like a grandparent or an uncle or whatnot. A lot of these are big treasury bonds worth thousands of dollars potentially. And a bond works like this. You give the federal government a certain amount of money, let's say $1,000, and they promise to pay you back at a certain date, potentially years later, maybe 5 years later, plus interest. So let's say they're going to pay you $1,000, or you're going to pay them $1,000 for that bond, and then 5 years later you get it back, and it's worth $1,100. So you've made $100 off of the federal government, and during that time, the federal government was able to have your money to buy things. It was basically part of the national debt. So when people create bonds through the Treasury Department, when people buy those bonds, they can make money, and they're basically lending to the federal government. And the federal government's pretty secure. It's probably one of the securest investments you could make because they promise to pay you back. And if they don't pay you back, it actually hurts our national credit score. Every country kind of has a credit score as well when it comes to lending, and the U.S. has one of the best credit scores on the planet. Now, also you could have debt from what's called intergovernmental debt. And this is the federal government borrowing from other areas of the federal government, promising to pay them back. For example, the federal government has numerous times in the past borrowed from Social Security and promised to pay it back. Now, we haven't necessarily had the revenues to pay it back, but we have promised to pay back the Social Security fund. This, of course, is a potential threat to Social Security. Now, to give you an idea of how our debt has changed over the years, look at these two graphics. On the bottom, it is debt as a fraction of the GDP. So we could look at the gross debt as roughly being over 100% of our GDP. So if every single person took every single dollar that's bought and sold in the United States, our total GDP, we could barely not pay our debt off. But that would take every single dollar from the entire year bought and sold in the United States to pay that off. Very difficult to imagine happening in 1 year, for sure. Now, the national debt is hovering around $20 trillion. We'll watch a little video about the national debt in class. And the interesting thing that happens with Congress is they often talk about what's called a debt ceiling. Congress has established a limit to try and restrict their spending. Oftentimes, politicians will talk about wanting to cut debt and, decrease the deficits every year and having, abundance of money. But also, there's a fear of two things. If you're a politician, it's really tough to increase taxes. So you can't increase revenue very easily because it's hard to get revoted when you increased everyone's taxes. People don't like taxes. But it's really difficult also to cut programs for those people. People like to keep receiving the benefits they are getting from the government, and they also don't want to see an increase in spending for those benefits. So it tends to be that our debt just keeps rising. And the debt ceiling was created by Congress to limit Congress on how much they could borrow. So they created a ceiling, a limit of how much money they could borrow. The only problem is, who controls where that limit is set? Well, Congress does. So whenever we get close to a debt ceiling, what ends up happening typically is Congress increases that debt ceiling. So kind of an arbitrary number that Congress has created to try to limit themselves, and every time they reach that ceiling, they decide to increase it. If they didn't increase the debt ceiling, essentially they would not be able to borrow money, and they essentially would be hurting our national credit score. Now, who does the U.S. owe money? Most of the national debt tends to be owed to U.S. citizens or U.S. companies that have taken out treasury bonds. But certainly we do owe some foreign debt. Countries like China and Japan and other different countries in the Caribbean, oil exporters, they have bought up treasury bonds. So those countries can invest in the United States by buying treasury bonds and getting money back. But you can also see we've borrowed money from ourselves, and certainly we've had mutual funds and different investments too. To give you an idea of, a couple of years ago, a comparison between countries that invest in the United States. Here's a good look at which ones tend to invest in the U.S. and we owe money to. Now, China isn't the one we owe the most to, really. It's the national public, the U.S. national public, that we tend to owe the most to. But China as a country is our largest debt holder. Now, what about expenditures? So I already talked about, it's hard to raise taxes on people to make more money, to not have these debt problems. What are we spending money on that's so expensive? We can kind of look at this chart of proposed spending from back in 2013. I'll show you some more recent spending goals from President Trump in class. It tends to be that you can tell where our budget's going to be by looking at last year's budget, plus a little itty bitty more. I already mentioned it's really hard to cut budgets, especially, if you want to cut them drastically, that's all but impossible. People don't like to see their programs cut. It's tough to cut, even things like the Department of Education. It's not very big. It's not hugely expensive. It doesn't have that big of an impact really on states per se. It's not most of the education systems are controlled by states. So why can't you cut it? Well, it's tough to cut because it looks like you're cutting education, and people like to invest in education in the United States. Now, the biggest expenditures always tend to be Social Security, Medicare, defense, and healthcare. Those are the biggest things. So look for those to be the biggest spending issues when we get to the budget this year. And those would be the areas where people could potentially have bigger cuts. Social Security and Medicare and healthcare are all but impossible to cut, but defense is an area that could be cut if someone wanted to save a bunch of money. It's an area that has a big chunk of the budget and is adjustable. Another look at the federal budget. You see mandatory spending. That is stuff that is mandatory by law that we have to spend that on, like veteran care and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and we have to pay back our interest. But the stuff on the right, discretionary spending, is stuff we can negotiate every single year, so stuff we can change. So that big chunk, the military spending, I already said, it's the biggest area that's easiest to adjust. Whereas, cutting half of the Department of Education would not make as much of an impact as cutting a little bit more of the military defense spending. Now, just to give you an idea of how the annual budget works, essentially what happens is the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, they formulate a budget based on what the president wants. They speak to federal agencies. They run those drafts past the federal agencies. They talk about what budgets they need, what budgets they've had in the past. Do they need increases? Is something coming up? So like the Census Bureau, they're going to want to get ready for the upcoming census. So they might need more money, invest it into their budget. Then the president submits his request to Congress. Now, almost always, Congress just kind of shrugs at the president's budget, and they draft their own. So it tends to be that they don't outright take what the president wants. So even this past year, Trump has already proposed a federal budget, and Congress has said, we'll look at it, but we're going to basically formulate a lot of that on our own as well. So then what happens is the House has it appear in their committees, and the Senate talks about it in their committee, and then they work together to basically pass some sort of budget, just like the bill to law process, but probably even more complex. More time with the House and the Senate meeting together, trying to plan out what the budget's going to look like. And eventually, it gets signed into law by the president. Hopefully looking like something that he wanted, but also something that Congress would want in the end. Probably the most important stuff here is definitely know what the OMB is, definitely know the president proposes a budget, and then Congress kind of does what they will with it. Anyway, that's all I have for this video on budget and taxes and debt. Make sure to leave any questions you have for me in the comments here, and I'll be able to respond in class to help you understand it a little bit more. Thank you, and have a great day.